welcome to the June edition of Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder. In this episode, we have a fun, carefree design for you. While the weather's changing and in many places it's starting to get hot, we are going to be sewing the Reef camisole or tank top design. And it's a lot of fun. I think it will be one that may become a wardrobe staple for you. Now, not every design has to be overly complicated, and so in this lesson, you're gonna see how quickly this design can go together. More importantly, we're gonna learn how to sew some bias, and I think you're gonna enjoy finding how bias designs and what the bias is, how that can work to our advantage in our sewing. Well, in this edition, we are going to be featuring all sorts of brand new wardrobe builder fabrics. All of the fabrics you see here are a beautiful rayon fabrics available over on nancysnotions.com. And I'm sure you're gonna wanna sew in one of the fabrics that we see featured here along with several others. They're comfortable and just a really great fabric, and I think you're gonna enjoy it as we roll along in Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder. Well, let's go ahead, head over to the cutting table, and let's get started. We have featured PDF pattern designs in Wardrobe Builder many times, so you should be very familiar with printing them out and taping them together. Make sure that you reference your pattern size chart to determine what size pattern you will be using and cut on the corresponding lines. Now, make sure if you want to add any width or length to your design that you do that prior to cutting it out of your fabric. The fit on this particular pattern is a fairly easy fit, so minimal to no pattern adjustments may be needed due to the type of fabric that you're making, and again, the very flowy, drapey design of this pattern. What's really important is that we want to pay attention to the green line. This design is cut on the bias, and as a reference, check out our Wardrobe Builder All Things Knit video, which talks a lot about fabric grain and how you would utilize that in sewing. Well, we are going to be sewing on the bias, and what that means is instead of cutting with our design perfectly parallel to the selvage, we are actually going to tilt our pattern piece. And it's going to feel odd if you've never sewn on the bias before. But now we have a grain line that is at a 45-degree angle. So this is the true bias. And this is our new grain line. It's marked on your pattern. And you are going to be cutting your design at an angle. Now, if you're using any sort of fabric that has a stripe or a pattern that you want to match, make sure that you cut your pieces going in the same direction, as there are different directions and different degrees of grain. All right, well, the other thing that we want to do when you're cutting a garment on the bias is you should really cut in a single layer and not on the fold. So my fabric is nice and flat. I only need one of the front pieces, which I have right here. So I have my fabric open, laying on the table. I'm going to cut a single layer. Now, let's talk about cutting this design on our fabric. If you're using one of our beautiful Wardrobe Builder rayons, and this fabric is just gorgeous, it has so many beautiful undertones to it, it will look good on anybody, I promise. Well, it has a little bit of wiggle to it, but you're going to find as we sew through this design that we are going to utilize the bias of this fabric to our advantage in many areas of assembly. And I think you might find that you're going to really love it and it may become one of your favorite designs. Well, we're working with a bias, and we know that true bias is a 45-degree angle. So look at that high degree of stretch on a fabric that is already fairly drapey and lightweight. So here are my tips for you in cutting this out. You can simply use pattern weights and or pins and pin your pattern to the fabric and cut around as you normally would. There is a possibility that your fabric will shift just a little bit in doing that. It's not a design that you're going to ruin it if you're slightly skewed in the cutting, but we do strive for accuracy in our cutting. So additional tips that I have: use your chalk, or if you have a clover chalk roller, Let me grab one of those out of my tool drawer here. So if you have a clover roller, what you can do is place your weights very close to the edge and then trace around your pattern. And I could actually do this whole thing with a single weight because as I hold that right next to the edge, it's not going to shift. I'm going to move that, trace all the way around it. Then I can remove the pattern and I can cut on that chalk line. And even if the fabric is moving as I'm cutting, as long as I cut on that line, it is going to be a nice precision cut. All right. Well, other things that you can do is you can put interfacing on the back of your fabric. Areas such as we have a facing piece, kind of an interesting shape. We have a facing piece, and then we have our camisole yoke, and then our back facing piece. These have some smaller areas and some very dominant contours and curves to the pattern piece. So I am going to recommend, and I love that our pattern instructions also address this form of cutting. But if you want to take a piece of fabric big enough for all of these pieces to fit on, and then fuse the entire piece, it's going to stabilize the fabric, and then you will be able to lay out your pieces that do require interfacing and cut them out already interfaced, because this shape right here is not fun to cut out freehand or to fuse interfacing over and get that all over your cutting table. Another tip for you, because this is a kind of a unique shape, your rotary cutter. So any of my quilters who are garment sewers as well, your rotary cutter comes in handy. Make sure you have a very sharp blade, use a smaller blade, and then you can additionally put a cutting mat under here and use your rotary cutter, and that will also give you a very nice precision cut, especially on a fabric that has some give to it. Well, those are a few options for you. Personally, what I do is I put my pattern block down and then I trace around with my chalk, and then I'm able to cut my pattern pieces out successfully. Just remember, pay attention to that grain line. Make sure all your pattern pieces are facing the same direction. Cut in a single layer. Take your time. This is not one of those designs you need to whack it out really quick, but it also doesn't have to take hours to cut either. A little bit of time in cutting out right now will ensure very speedy sewing later on. Not that we're trying to rush, but sometimes a little care up front helps us have better success further along in the process. All right, well, let's move on to our next step. The first step in assembling our tank top will be creating the yoke pieces, which I have here. The neat thing about this particular pattern is it's going to go together fairly quickly, and you're going to be able to do several steps at a time while you're at the machine before you need to hop up and run to the iron as we move along in the process. Another thing about this particular design is that we've already done the interfacing on the back of all of our pieces that need interfacing, so that step has been completed as well. Well, as I mentioned, we're going to start with creating the yoke, and you will notice that, and here, let's overlap. So this is kind of what this is going to look like on the back of our tank. Now, right now we have right sides together. So we have the pretty side of the fabric touching each other, so right sides together. What's going to be important on this particular piece is that you don't mix up the neckline edge, which is the longer gradual curve, with the arm opening, which is the shorter, deeper curve. So later on, when we go to overlap these, make sure that you're not putting the wrong edges together. All right, well, I love bias sewing, and there are a few mannerisms that we can use when we're sewing. And on this particular pattern, we are using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance unless otherwise stated. So just make sure that you follow along in your pattern guide. Now, these edges on the yoke come to a fairly narrow point, and as you're sewing them, you're going to feel like you're going off the fabric, or that you're coming to a too narrow of a location, but that's intentional. All right. And especially at the top edge here where this joins the shoulder, you're just going to have a very narrow opening there to turn this inside out. And that's correct. So don't feel like you've done anything wrong and you're cutting in that regards. The other thing I want to point out is, even though we have interfaced the back of the yoke facing pieces, so here the back side has interfacing fused, as does the other side, and then this side does not, we still have a lot of flexibility in our garment using the bias, and we learned about that at the beginning of our lesson. The cool thing about sewing with the bias is it doesn't really fray. So if you were to kind of pull this, you'd notice that these long edges really don't fray. But the other thing is that as you're sewing, you can kind of move your pattern piece. Let's kind of flip that around here. So as I do that, you'll notice that I have a very flexible seam. So that can work to our advantage because we can basically make a straight line rather than having to sew in a curve. What can be a disadvantage is we don't want to pull or stretch that as we're sewing. And that bias does have some give to it. That's where that interfacing is going to help stabilize. But unless we put a very stable interfacing on there, we're still going to have some give to this edge. So pay particular attention when you're sewing the yoke and the neckline on this particular design, that you're not stretching out the neckline. Now, when we get to the front, we're going to be adding some twill tape. I'm going to omit that on the back piece. Now, remember, we've got these narrow points here. So I'm going to recommend that you put your presser foot in about maybe 3/4 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. Put your needle down. That way it doesn't suck the very end of that down into the machine. We're going to take a couple stitches, go in reverse, and then go forward. Now, on this particular pattern, we are using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, just a little reminder there. So make sure you're following along with your machine. Now, my machine is set up to where the edge of the presser foot is running right along with the edge of the fabric right here. And I am going to be using the extra long magic pins. I have a whole bunch of them right here. And I have really gotten into the habit of using different pins for different projects based on how they work. Now, the nice thing about this type of pin is that it also works as a little bit of a poker, and you'll just see it's a real fine, well, it's a pin, so it's very fine. I'll kind of hold it there. I am able to hold the edge of the fabric right here right up to the point where it enters the presser foot. So I can remove a pin. And I have just a few. This is a project where you will want to put a few pins along the edges just to hold them together so that they don't shift. But I can remove a pin and then use that to hold. All right, throw that in the pin caddy, grab another pin, use that to hold. And there's really minimal, none shifting of the fabric. If you're newer to this type of fabric or this type of sewing, you may run into just a scant amount of shifting just because it's new to you. As you become more familiar, that will go away. And hopefully by the time you're done with this project, that too will be eliminated. So I have matching threads, so you may or may not be able to see, but it makes just a really beautiful seam. And remember, we still have some give in that, which is going to work to our advantage with our fabric and the style. All right, I'm going to go around the arm's eye. Remember, starting just a little in from the edge. If you took the time in the cutting of your pattern pieces, you should have nice, precise edges. Even better if you've used a rotary cutter, that too will have helped so that your pieces just are perfectly even, and that helps in lining everything up as well. Well, this looks beautiful. What I'm going to do next is repeat on the other yoke, and then our instructions have us trim the seam allowance down to about to about 1/8 of an inch, and then we can do some clipping. I am going to leave that up to your discretion based on the fabric that you're using. This particular fabric, it's a beautiful rayon. It has give to it. It's certainly not going to fray, but I feel that the 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm probably not going to trim any of that off because then you do run the risk of your seam line fraying out. So I'm actually fine not trimming the seam allowance down actually on most seams of this particular pattern. And as far as clipping your seams go, you might put a few clips right in the arm's eye curve, but again, you're working with a bias and it's a narrow seam allowance and it has a lot of give to it. So I am going to recommend that you be very conservative on how many clips that you put in there, because you're basically just allowing areas of the pattern to fray with normal wear and tear. So again, our bias allows us to kind of bypass some of that. Let's grab a safety pin. We're going to finish this step up, and I'm going to put a safety pin through the side that has the interfacing on it. And I'm just sticking that safety pin right at the top. I did not pin through both layers. I kind of opened that up and I just clipped it right at the very top. The next thing is I'm going to push my pin down in there. Whoops, the head first. And we will be able to flip this inside out. There we go. Sometimes it takes a moment for the pin to cooperate. All right, and then I'm going to be able to pull this right side out. This is a narrow opening. It's pretty easy to flip inside out. What you don't want to do is just grab and tug. You really should kind of ease a little bit of that narrow area through first, and I don't force it. I just kind of do about 1/8 of an inch at a time, get it started, and you'll know once it really gets past the hump there. One more, that looks pretty good. All right, and now we're going to reach through the inside here, and we are going to push the pin down through. Almost. There we go. I'll pull just a little more of that up. Clipping that towards the top edge does help with this turning inside out a little faster. I would suggest that leaving that in there is going to basically interface and provide a little more stability to that narrow area. So it's worth a little bit of time just kind of wiggling that back and forth. Okay, so here we go. We'll grab that through. And of course, holding it off to an angle so you can see always adds one little element of difficulty. There we go. So we pulled that through. So now see how then easily I could pull that through. I'm going to take the safety pin off. And the nice thing about having not trimmed that area is that when I turn this inside out, it's all self-interfaced. Even though I've not pressed this yet, the nice thing is that it's pretty much folded right on the edge of the seam. And so I don't have to worry about shifting. There'd be no way to do any understitching on a machine that far up in the project. So again, now we've got a nice durable strap that is not going to fray out. All right, now the next thing is we're gonna go over to our iron and lay this nice and flat. And we're gonna just make sure we kind of get that seam right in the middle, folded in half. Using that bias, we can kind of work the seam. We're going to press it so it's nice and flat and move on to our next step. All right, well, we are on to the next step, or shall I say steps, in creating our tank top. And this is really fun because I have all of our tank top pieces right here in a pile, and we are pretty much going to deviate a little from our instruction sheet. Not too much, but I know that when I sew, I like to sit down and do as many steps as I can to a garment before I get up and move around. It just helps it to go really efficiently. So we are going to first put a stay stitch across the top of the top of the back edge of the tank top. Now, a moment ago, we created this really fun yoke, and this yoke is going to be attached to this back edge. And I want to point out that the yoke does not go from one edge all the way across to the other. So these are going to be overlapped to where the bottom edge matches exactly. All right, well, we're going to set that aside because we do want to stay stitch across this edge. It's kind of a square-ish rectangle piece based on your size. So make sure that you're going across the top of the pattern and not the hem line. All right, well, let's go ahead, and we're just going to go ahead and lengthen my stitch just a little. And I'm stitching 1/4 of an inch across the top. And I'm going to do this stay stitching kind of quickly. So if it varies just a little bit, it's not going to hurt anything because we can pull this stitching out once the garment is assembled. So it's actually gonna work to our advantage to just basically put a stitch on there, either just inside or just outside the seam line. All right, we'll set that aside. And I have our 2 yoke pieces pressed. You'll see that they look much flatter and more beautiful. And I love this fabric, by the way. It's just beautiful. All right, well, what I did was I overlapped the bottom edge, put some pins in there, and I'm gonna keep my stay stitch length on there. And remember, these long pins work great as an extra set of hands and a very fine pointer. I don't need to backstitch here because I'm just anchoring them together. So we'll remove my pin and keep stitching across there. And there we go. So we are now all across our yoke. All right, well, now we're going to set that aside because that is now anchored together. So I'm going to set that off to the side. We're now going to pull out the front of the tank top. And it is going to seem like we are just really rolling through this design, and we are. This is such a great pattern. Okay, well, we are going to do right sides together, and you might be saying, how do I even tell the right side? Well, remember, on our yoke, the back sides have the interfacing attached and the front side does not. So you want to make sure now that the side that has the interfacing in it, and it'll be a little stiffer, that is facing up because it is the wrong side. And we are going to line up the shoulder edges, and this is a kind of a camouflage type fabric, but if you look ever so carefully, you're going to see that that narrow strap, it is going to nest right in between the edges. So if you look real close, and maybe I'll put a pin right here, you'll be able to see on either side. All right, so if we see that ever so carefully, that when we stitch these together, we're going to stitch on either side of the shoulder seam. So let's anchor the top of that with a pin. And the next thing we are going to do is we are going to take our top facing, and this is kind of a fun design because it has a real neat letter M, kind of a cursive M shape to it. And this, I'm going to point out the edges to this because at the end of assembly, I'm going to reference that you can finish off these edges. You can do that now if you want to. For example, if you want to serge around that, It is interfaced and it is on the bias, so you're not going to have a lot of fraying. There may be some subtle fibers on there, but you're not going to have strings of fibers hanging off of there. I would propose that on lighter fabrics, such as these beautiful rayons, and if you're using other special occasion fabrics and silk, I would recommend that you either just ever so carefully turn this edge under and just put a single row of stitching through that, or you leave it. The disadvantage to putting serging on that is it's going to show through when you're pressing, whereas the raw edge, it's not going to fray, number one, and it's just going to keep it much flatter. So this is a project you can do without a serger if you do not have one. Don't overstyle, don't over sew it. But of course, depending on the fabric that you're using, maybe if you're sewing in a business setting, or depending on, what you're making and who it's for, that may determine if you need to do that or not. Okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some pins all the way around the neckline. As I do this, I'm going to be ever so careful not to catch any of the yoke underneath there. So let's go ahead and finish pinning our facing. We'll lay this out here. We'll get that pinned on, and then we're going to stitch all the way around, and then we'll be ready to move on to our next step. To trim or not to trim? That is the question. Now, my same recommendation stands. We have fairly narrow 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so I am going to recommend not trimming these seams down any further. That way there's just a nice roll to the seam and a nice natural interfacing. We have that same bias going on in the arm's eye, so if you are going to clip that, just a few very conservative clips on that. Now, the neckline area is an area where we are going to take a clip, and we have this nice V that comes in the front. And what I would maybe recommend, if you don't sew points this way, what I suggest is that you stitch down and then you take one stitch across and then you resume stitching upward. It would be the same thing that you would do on like a collar point, and that way you actually have a nice point rather than puckering of your fabric. But you do need to clip down to, but not through. So I'm going to do that step here, to but not through. And if you had a little deeper seam allowance in your stitching, you could trim that. But again, that's nothing that is abnormal, so I'm going to leave that. This piece is a little bit easier to turn inside out because we can just grab the tail, or the tails if you want to call them that, the straps on the shoulder seam, and pull those inside out, and it's going to pull that fabric with it. Now, I do want to go to my iron and put a nice press on this. Let's flip this over, just so that that seam allowance will lay nice and flat. And if you are using our wardrobe builder rayon, this is such a beautiful fabric. It just presses beautifully. You get an amazing crease along all edges. So this will lay just seamlessly nice and flat. And again, back to our edge, you can finish that if you choose to, or keep it plain and just utilize that so that it's not going to have show through on the outside. Okay, well, we do need to press this, but we can pause for a moment before we hurry and run off to the iron. We're in an entirely different area. We are going to hop to the back side of the pattern, and we have our yoke here. Now, the next thing we can do is take our lower portion of the back, and I'm going to make sure I grab the edge that has that stay stitching on there. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to line these up right sides together so that I'm stitching the yoke to the top edge. So I'm going to fold this. If I don't have any sort of notch or marking, I'm going to fold this and put a tiny clip or chalk mark just to indicate where the center of that is. And you will not believe how quick this design is going to come together. So you can also put a pin there, and then we're going to go to our yoke and put a pin there on the center. And I know that's the center because it's right straight down from that crisscross intersection. And at this point, I may lay the skirt, or I'll call it the skirt. It's kind of just the lower dress part. I can lay that on top, or if it's easier for you to have the yoke facing up, then you can stitch across. I tend to like the yoke facing up because I can see exactly where the yoke attaches. Let me put my pin down there. So you can see exactly where this will end, and that way you're ensuring that you're going to catch that into the seam. So let's lay this down. And we're just going to basically baste that together. You can leave your pin in there if you want to, and then stitch over top of it. I know some of you hate that. It's just a comfort. There are many instances in sewing where that is a huge control. So those of you that really like to be in control, if you want to be in control of your pins, it's not going to hurt it if you're, again, just comfortable with that particular step. It does eliminate a lot of shifting in your fabric. So, and we've seen that in our pants lessons and doing waistbands and things. Okay, well, we're going to leave this nice and flat. We're still on the back of our design. We are going to put the back facing on the back piece. So I like to lay things down so I know that this edge is going to join this edge of my design. All right, and possibly yours looks upside down on your cutting table too. This is usually the direction that I work. So I'm going to lay these right on top of each other, and I'm going to put some pins in there to line them up. Again, those really long, I don't tend to use a lot of pins when I'm sewing. Sometimes you don't need very many, but sometimes you do need a pin, and these long ones just give you a little extra hand. So you can use a pin, but not overdo it. And it covers a large area. All right, well, there we go. I've got a few of those long pins in there. I'm going to start on one side. Now I'm going to change my stitch length so it's back to regular stitching. All right. And there we go. My machine was telling me to put my presser foot down. And I'm just going to stitch across this. I'm stitching on areas that have multiple amounts of interfacing. So we have interfacing on the facing. Additionally, we have interfacing on the wrong side of the back side of the yoke. So basically there's interfacing sandwiched inside this piece. So this is a very stable area here. So you'll notice that I don't really need to hold it with the pin. It's not really moving or shifting as I do move those pins. And I'm able to just look right at the edge of my presser foot and stitch right across this. It's not a project that I'm really worried about trying to be as fast as I can when sewing. It's more a project of just having everything right at your fingertips. And I'm not really relying on looking at the steps in the pattern. I've already sewn multiples of this. It's such a great design. So once you sew a couple, you pretty much have it memorized anyways. So you can sit down and kind of knock out several of these. All right, well, I am going to go to my iron finally. I'm going to lay it down just like this, and I'm going to press the facing down, and then I'm going to roll the back yoke up. And then I'm going to press that down, and then I'm going to turn the facing under and press that so that we have a nice, beautiful flat edge. And you'll see once I stitch that and press it, that it is going to be nice and flat. The next step will be our side seams and our hem, and we are done. It is really that easy. So I hope you're enjoying this. Let's get this pressed and we'll finish the side seams. Okay, well, I just got back from my ironing station and I have ironed the front neckline. We have that facing pressed under. I pressed the back facing down. I did have a scant amount of my stay stitching showing, so I pulled that row of stitching out really quick, and we are ready to do the side seams. And I just, again, want to point out that this really is a design because of it being cut on the bias. There are lots of advantages to that, especially when it does not fray. So you'll notice that there is not an edge finish on this bias binding. There are things you can do to finish this off if you wanted to stitch down a little piece of lace or some hem tape. Now keep in mind, this is going to be touching your skin on the upper back. So whatever you put there, you want it to be very soft. You can certainly do like a Hong Kong finish if you wanted to wrap a ribbon around this edge. But again, it's not one of those designs that we need to over sew because it really is just a simple tank top. And if we're making it in other fabric variations, there may not be a need to have an edge finish there. But I know some of you, if you're into couture sewing, there are a lot of beautiful hand stitches that you could do on that as well. And additionally, if you wanted to line this, cut your lining on the bias and you could sew a lining to this bottom edge. If you were wanting to line this, let's just kind of address this on the front issue. How do you think you would line the front? Well, there are a couple different ways. I would recut the facing so that it just came straight across the pattern, and then I would just have a seam line right here where the fabric would hang down. One concern I would have is that it would put a line across the front. So based on like this fabric would probably camouflage that, but if it were a solid color, that line might show. So the other option would be to have just basically stitch this facing down over top of a lining so that your lining basically has the same facing and that you have a lining that is basically the same shape as the front piece. So there are a couple other ways you could pattern that. But for this particular design, I think we're fine doing exactly what we're doing here. Okay, well, let's do the side seams. You know, one thing really exciting about sewing is that there really are so many things that you can do, and based on your interest level and skill level and techniques that you want to try, you can add them to almost any pattern. Well, we are going to lay right sides together and match up our side seams. Now, this is going to be a really important one that we do not stretch and pull as we sew, or we're going to get some ripples. Now, With bias clothing, there are times when you would stretch to do some sewing. We're not going to do that here, all right? But what we do want to do is we want to open up the facing. All right, so you'll see that we have facing, and then here's the seam line, and then we are going to open up the facing. And this is so similar to what we did on waistbands in our March edition when we did pants, and then in April when we did jeans. So isn't it interesting how sometimes those same techniques transcend from one garment to the other? I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to put it in perpendicular to the seam, and what I'm going to do is I am going to open these and I am going to make sure that those seam lines are right on top of each other, and I am going to weave this pin in and out so that it holds those together. So when I stitch across here, we're going to get a nice intersection that's nice and precise. And this is one of those areas that, yes, you sew over the pin, so there is not a bit of shifting. So we are still using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so we want to make sure we back stitch. I'm not going to go really fast because I am going to be careful stitching over this pin. If you're not comfortable with that at all, come right up to the pin, reach around, grab your hand wheel, and just turn the wheel till it goes over the pin 2 or 3 stitches. And then you can leave it in there or pull it out. All right, we're gonna stitch right down the side seams, and you'll notice that these kind of fall in place, so I'm not even really pinning them, but I'm also taking care not to pull and cause any shifting in the fabric. All right, now I have a scant amount of excess hanging down. It's just a very little bit. And this particular design has a contoured hem that is different from the front to the back. And so you may have an edge where, based on how you cut your fabric, or if there was a little shifting or how wide of a seam allowance, you may have just a tiny little bit that you need to trim off. So feel free just to trim that off so that I'll hold this up to the machine here. You can see that that's a nice straight edge when we go to do the hem. All right, and then we'll check the other side. Let's see. Well, here I haven't sewn the other side. So let's do that first. All right, we are at the end of that, and here you'll kind of see where there's just a little bit of a blending that needs to be done from the front to the back. And so you can simply take your scissors and just kind of trim. It's not even 1/4 of an inch, and you'll see there as I hold that up there that now flattens that out, and I don't have to worry about it coming to a peak. And that's just, I think, a little discrepancy in the transition from the front to the back. Okay, well, we can go ahead and press our side seams. I can wait to do that. I'm going to go ahead and put the hem in here. And then I'm gonna just press the hem and the side seams at the same time, and we have created our beautiful tank design. Well, the hem is gonna be lots of fun. It is nothing new to any of you if you've been following along in Wardrobe Builder, because we are doing our narrow rolled hem. Now, with the bias fabric, it really works to our advantage again, because as we roll this fabric, that stretch allows this hem to fall beautifully in place. Hey, experiment. You'll see that I'm not going to put any pins in this at all. It's just naturally going to flow. I think that a rolled hem is the best one to learn on because it just falls really nicely. And then when you translate that to other woven fabrics, there's not as many surprises. But let's go ahead and roll this under. And I'm just doing about 1/8 of an inch turn and then an additional 1/8 of an inch turn. I'm going to put my needle down and then my foot will kind of hold that in place. So you'll see just that very narrow rolled hem. I'm able to look at my machine and I'm stitching pretty close to just the very top edge of where that roll is. And I know that's real kind of faint. I'll hold that up here for you to see what that's going to look like. But our whole hem will look like this, and it's a very professional finish. And you will see that I'm just going to go about 3 or 4 inches, shift my fabric, and it will naturally start to fold into the fold. I don't even need a rolled hem foot. If you have one, you certainly could use that, but see how I position the fabric? You can even take your finger and kind of press it before it goes right into the machine. Well, thank you for joining me in another edition of Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder. Well, I want to share one more tip with you. Be creative. Do you know that any of the Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder fabrics can be used in this project? How about using our beautiful shantung that's available in many colors to make a dressier version? Throw on a pearl necklace, some heels, maybe some leggings, and you're ready to go to dinner. Or pull something like this out of your sewing stash and make a swimsuit cover up. The sky is the limit. The key is make it you. Well, don't forget to like and subscribe so that you are notified anytime a new lesson is available, and there are many more to come. Well, join me again in another edition of Wardrobe Builder, and we will see you the next time.